My name is Andrew Smith. I wanted to take a brief moment at the very beginning to introduce the RCs, who are representatives of the MVP program. So first and foremost, my name is Andrew Smith. My pronouns are he, him. I am the Greater Connecticut River Valley Regional Coordinator. So a lot of you, I know a lot of you, and it's just great to see so many of you today. And why don't we go around from west to east, and we'll do it that way.
Hi, everybody. My name is Carrie Ann Petrick. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm the regional coordinator for the Berkshires and Hill Towns.
Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Hillary King, the Central Regional Coordinator, and I use she, her pronouns.
Good morning. I'm Carolyn Mecklenburg. I'm the Greater Boston Regional Coordinator. I use she, her pronouns.
Good morning. I'm Michelle Rowden, and I am the Northeast Regional Coordinator, and I use she, her pronouns.
I think that's it, Andrew.
Oh, okay,
there's Courtney. She can't unmute
Courtney
herself.
cannot unmute herself. So we also have Courtney, our Southeast Regional Coordinator, online, but she can't unmute herself. So with that, Michelle, let's go to the next slide. All right, so welcome. We're glad you can join us for our Building Trust in Community Partnerships webinar. This is the second in our 2022 webinar series. For those of you who joined us for our local and regional climate adaptation tools webinar last week, welcome back. For those of you who missed last week's webinar, you can find a full-length recording on our website, resilientma.org/MVP, which is an excellent time to call attention to the fact that we are recording. We have great speakers today, and we know you're going to have thoughtful questions for each of them. But we do ask that when you have questions for our speakers, please submit them in the chat box, and we're going to use those later for Q&A at the end of the presentations. If we are interrupted during today's webinar, we'll immediately cancel, end the session, and work to reschedule with our participants. Before we get started, the MVP Program Manager, Kara Runston, is going to share some important program updates with you. Next slide.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kara Runston. I use she, her pronouns. And yeah, I just have a few quick updates. If you were on the webinar last week, you've already heard all of them, so it'll be a refresher. But we are in the middle of our winter webinar series right now. Have a really great lineup of speakers today for this webinar, so we're excited to hear more about their projects. And then next week, we have our first inaugural MVP virtual networking event. So we're really excited to kick that off and have everybody join and kind of share ideas on that webinar. So that will be a really exciting event. And you can still sign up for that if you like. We currently have our expression of interest for the FY23 Action Grant round open. The final deadline for that is February 1st, so you just have a couple more days to submit your project idea. And then in terms of our FY23 grant round, we expect that to open in March. We are expecting at least $21 million budget, thinking that it might be more than that this year. So definitely get your ideas in for the grant round. We're excited to be able to hopefully support a lot of really great projects this year. And we'll be scheduling the pre-RFR session soon to go over the changes to the RFR and the application. So definitely sign up for our newsletter to be notified of that. The link is at the bottom of this slide, and we will be posting these slides after this webinar. So you'll be able to find them on our website. And then finally, we are currently launching an effort that you may have heard about to revamp the MVP planning grant program. So now that a lot of plans are at the 5-year mark, how are we going to be updating those and keeping them relevant and moving us all forward on our climate resilience endeavors? So there'll be opportunities to weigh in on that, and definitely, again, sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. I think that is it, so I'll pass it back over to Andrew.
Great, thanks, Kara. Next slide, please. So the 3MV projects we're going to learn about today represent excellent examples of the work municipalities are doing to foster trust and build partnerships throughout the Commonwealth. Trust and partnerships build social resilience, which is a critically important component of a climate resilient community. Having trusting relationships and working partnerships between local government, community groups, and community members will help to ensure that multiple perspectives and voices are represented as we work to make our communities more resilient to the impacts of climate change. Being open to these multiple perspectives and listening to new voices can help us identify climate solutions that are intrinsic to the communities we serve. Each project team you'll hear from this morning has unique insights to offer. We hope you come away with clear, concrete examples that you can use in your professional practice as you work to build a resilient community. I'm now going to turn it over to the City of Springfield so they can talk about their exciting, wonderful project. Next slide. Oh, silly me. These are our speakers. Sorry. So we have Tina Quagliato-Sullivan, Director of Disaster Recovery, Talia G, Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, and Samantha Hamilton from Live Well Springfield and the Public Health Institute of Western Massachusetts. Take it away. Next slide, please.
Hi, my name is Tina Quagliato-Sullivan. I am the City of Springfield's Director of Disaster Recovery and Compliance. Our project focused around connecting with residents and sort of building out the civic infrastructure of the city. We recognized through a lot of our previous work and the planning and reports that we had done that Springfield's largest chronic stressor was really the vulnerability of our residents. And research has demonstrated that governments that build out trust and effective lines of communication with their residents, particularly our most vulnerable residents prior to disasters, experience better recovery processes from disasters overall. Our past planning process had also indicated that many residents did not have high levels of trust in local government and in government overall, but we sort of focused on the local government piece. And so we sort of recognized that building these relationships and building out these lines of communication were invaluable to ensure that there was an equitable recovery from shocks across all of our populations, and that we would need to kind of work on these relationships and strengthening them continuously. So we put together a project. We brought on partners that included the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, the Public Health Institute of Western Massachusetts, Arise for Social Justice, Wayfinders, and Neighbor to Neighbor. Next slide. Sorry, am I supposed to be doing the slides?
No,
You're
we
not
have
seeing the next one?
Michelle's doing it.
Okay, here we go.
Okay, there we go.
So we formed a resident advisor board, and the goals of that board was basically to improve trust between residents and particularly residents of the targeted neighborhoods where the most vulnerability existed and city departments. We also had a goal to improve the knowledge and understanding among residents of the city's resilience initiatives and to improve our methods of city communication and outreach, and also to sort of improve the quality of information that was being transmitted to the public and gain a better understanding of what the public was absorbing from the information we were putting out there, and then to bring on a consultant who would develop a report with recommendations to improve our communication and outreach. Next slide. So the way the resident advisor board worked was we would pay stipends to residents, and they would bring their input on various issues that were aimed at improving that communication with residents. And so not only were they bringing their input, but part of their homework was that they also had to talk to folks within their networks and bring back some of their input and feedback on the various things we were working on. And then they would also push out information from those meetings to their networks. So we would meet on a monthly basis with residents. We would talk about various communication related issues and resilience issues. They would provide us feedback on things like city press releases and literature that was going out there or other outreach activities that we were doing. We would discuss sort of the different information that they took away from that and from those items, and what information could have been better communicated to them or communicated in a way that would help them sort of get a better grasp of the overall activity or provide better information. There was also an educational component to the resident advisor board. So we enlisted various city department heads and staff to provide presentations around the various departments' climate and resilience activities. And that included departments like DPW, Park, Forestry, Emergency Management. Like I sort of spoke about earlier, residents would take that educational information, share it with their networks, families, friends, neighbors, and then provide feedback back to us about how we could better reach them and their neighbors. And then at the end, residents were provided a personal thank you letter from the mayor and a certificate, obviously, but more importantly, to show them that the mayor was listening and had heard some of their feedback. And both him and his staff would regularly check in at meetings and listen to what was happening in them. Next slide. So I think Sam Hamilton's going to take this over from the Public Health Institute of Western Mass.
Yes, thank you, Tina. So we wanted to kind of share some of the community perspectives. We recognize that in ways we're trying to get communities at the table, we're also limited in our own capacity. So the committee really tried to be flexible and to have meeting times for residents to attend. But we were also balancing out getting department folks in the room as well to also collaborate with the residents. The residents did have to do homework or do outreach to other folks in the community, their friends, their neighbors, to understand the barriers for folks in connecting with the city. And then the committee practiced the habit of breaking down terms and terminologies, acronyms, to ensure that we had a collective understanding of what the group was saying. So that was one big place where folks really need to know what does this represent, who are we talking about, and also terminology, so they can really feel like they're buying into what we're sharing and also owning part of the work as well. We also try to facilitate and to do planning with partners to be thoughtful of how the engagement process was for residents and the impacts that they contribute to the process. So as much as we could, once we had the findings and recommendations for the city, we shared that back with them. And knowing that also our grant was limited in time, we engaged for 6 months with residents, but from the beginning, they were excited about participating and engaged. We also reflected the transparency that this was a short-term project. We're gathering together for now, and if and when possible, if resources were available, we could gather again at some point in the future. But that realistic expectation was what we had to share with the barriers that we faced and how could we move forward, and if we could move forward, what would that look like? And I also say, I wanted to share, never underestimate the power of an icebreaker. In those icebreaker moments when we checked in the beginning, we took off our titles and our positions and became people in a room in the middle of a pandemic, collaborating around an issue that matters to them. And we got to know the department folks, not by their position, but by their name. And also there was so much shared capacity between both groups of residents and city folks that folks felt that they took away something. They did take away more understanding of how city government works. And we also, city government also took away the understanding of how to connect with community. And those icebreakers were very thoughtful places where you can let your hair down and just laugh and check in, especially in a critical time where the pandemic was looming over us as we were planning this work. Next slide, and I'll pass it back to Tina.
So I will say Samantha did some really great icebreakers, and it looks like they're asking for examples, which maybe once we wrap up our presentation, you can give some of those. And I will say it was as a city department head, it was really helpful to sort of make those connections with residents that were separate of work, that were more personal. So one of the other components of our project was we sort of looked at utilizing public employment as a tool to equity. So recognizing that poverty, unemployment, and economic disparity is a long-term stressor in the city, and it makes our residents extremely vulnerable to shocks. And so, we want public policy to uplift our residents that have traditionally been marginalized and utilize it as a way to bring about economic equity across the city's entire population. And again, just sort of recognizing that that's really Springfield's path forward if we want to achieve long-term resilience to future shocks. So we did bring on an outside consultant to also assist us with basically reviewing all of our current hiring practices and provide a better understanding of barriers to public employment for our environmental justice populations and residents, and to give us some recommendations to bridge that public employment gap and try to create greater economic equity among Springfield's populations. And so I am going to hand it over to Talia G, who is our Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for the city, to talk more about that and also how it's sort of tied into Springfield's overall diversity and equity work. Next slide.
Thank you, Tina. So sorry, I'm getting feedback. Is my audio okay? Okay, so as Tina mentioned, we really wanted to focus on economic opportunities within the city. And so the consultant first asked us to take a look at our values and our overall diversity and equity strategy for our residents. And so our core values here are residency, really focusing on the people who live, work, and play in Springfield, as well as those who are educated here. And then also our diversity. Springfield's a really diverse area in terms of age, race, ethnicity, different abilities or disabilities, and as well as education. And so we really wanted to capitalize on that. And then lastly, value customer service and some of what Tina discussed before, which is really the interface or the relationships that that the city government has with our employees, and really doing that by hiring qualified employees who can really provide great customer service at the end of the day. And so our goal is to hire employees that could meet these core values, and especially if they were either already Springfield residents or were willing to become Springfield residents. And so we recognized that we had a wealth of viable candidates and applicants within our Springfield borders. And so when we worked with the consultant, we really took a look at how we were communicating and interfacing with that potential population. And so the consultant took a look at everything from how candidates apply to how we outreach for jobs, the qualifications that are required for jobs, our salary structure, our incentives or bonus or cost of living increase structures, things of that nature, and how that relates to our overall diversity strategy. And so the consultants interviewed me. They worked with the Human Resources Department, Labor Relations, and Tina's office as well, to really look at every angle of how we hire, how we retain applicants, and particularly how we're serving our residents. Next slide, and I'll turn it back over to Tina. Thank you.
Tina, you're on mute.
Sorry. So I think, we sort of gave a brief overview of, what the projects were. And I think it's important to sort of look at now what we've taken away from that. And I think, and how we're moving forward. I think anyone that has worked in municipal government understands that nothing happens rapidly. And so, we took in an awful lot of information from residents and from consultants. And I think we're still sort of digesting that and trying to take small incremental steps forward and make small changes, which ultimately turn into big changes. So currently we are utilizing MVP funds to increase awareness and participation in the city's neighborhood councils. So again, as a way to build out two-way communication channels with residents, one of the primary avenues the city uses for that communication is through our neighborhood councils, which are residents that are elected by other residents to represent the various neighborhoods. And so through our work on the Resident Advisor Council, I think we got some feedback from residents that discussed how not all of the neighborhood councils are always representative of the populations that actually live there. So we are giving the neighborhood councils this year funding to allow them to do more awareness activities and to try to recruit diverse participation, particularly from our most vulnerable residents and residents that are least likely to apply. And so we're kind of getting that work underway now with the neighborhood councils. We are also working with partners to develop a better database for improved outreach around various city programs and activities. Our city council has created a new committee focused on public accessibility. And we are also utilizing recommendations from the communications report to make updates to our website and social media to better guide program outreach and to reflect some of the recommendations around simplifying what we're saying and making it easier for folks to understand and access. And that is what we have for you presentation-wise. Thank you for listening.
All right, that's great. So we have some good questions in our chat box. I think there's a little bit of feedback. Okay, great. So yeah, we have some time for questions and some answers here. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna go through this question. So first question is, how did you gather the group of people for resident advocates, and how was the initial request to join this project framed?
Sure. So I think, from the city perspective, we recruited partners who then recruited the residents. So I think maybe Samantha, you might be able to talk better to how, as partners, you guys actually brought residents on.
Yeah, so yes, that's the process. We identified our community partners to help with identifying residents. And these residents have been working with us on other climate-related projects. So the other capacity that they have was they were comfortable in talking about resiliency work because they've been doing this with our climate justice initiative. And they've been advocating for climate change, either personally or in other spaces.
All right, these are good answers. People are getting engaged. So there's another sort of nuts and bolts question here, which is how much was the stipend that was offered for resident board members, and how much was offered in order to yield good results?
Sam, do you remember the exact amount that each resident received? Because I have the total overall budget amount, but I don't recall the exact amount.
Yeah, so it was a set rate of $100 a month. And that is I think we've come to that understanding with working with other partners. That's a healthy amount where engagement is comfortable, but burden is not too much. And I think over the course of the I think 4 to 6 months, that's what folks were kind of got received for each meeting that they attend monthly.
I do recall, so this is me interjecting, there was some support too if like people needed support with like paying for like internet access because of Zoom. You guys did that as well. Am I incorrect in that?
Yeah, that was something Catherine and I had talked about making available. I don't remember if anyone actually needed it. We did have a lot of folks that logged on through their phones, I recall, and so they were able to utilize that if they didn't have regular computer access.
Okay, thanks for answering that. All right, so this is the one that people have really gotten excited about. So can Samantha give some good examples of icebreakers? Apparently these are hard to plan, so people are looking for some expertise here.
So one of the quickest and easiest is how people are showing up in the room, because we, again, recognizing the pandemic, we're all coming from different spaces, different departments and positions. We just asked folks, how are you checking in? How are you feeling today? And that revealed, folks are coming from a long day, but they're present. They're coming from being energized. So I lean into the folks that, hey, we're going to lean into the folks that have energy and have empathy for the folks that are tired today. But I'm acknowledging and appreciating how you're showing up. Thematically, it could be about the seasons, what's your favorite season? What are you looking forward to? Even just recognizing, what do you look forward to after this pandemic is over? And I know that's hard to say because we're still in it, but what people hope for and how folks are coping and connecting with their family. So these are just top questions. So folks are saying, I'm using Zoom to talk to my sister who's in this place. I'm really connecting with family this way because it's been a hard time. So those are some of the icebreakers, and those are more heartfelt connections where folks can really empathize with each other and go from there. So those are my suggestions.
All right. Thank you for sharing that experience with us. So those are some good takeaways for all of our practical lives. So I think we're gonna stop there because we have a few more questions coming in that we might be able to save for our sort of group panel at the end. So thank you. I learned a lot. So hope other folks did too. And now we're going to go over to the Housatonic Stream restoration for regional flood resilience in Lennox. We have Aaliyah Del Molino from Green Agers, Allison Dixon from Berkshire Watershed Conservation. She's the manager and also the Housatonic Valley Association, as well as Gwen Miller, AICP, land use director and planner for the town of Lennox. And next slide, and I'm going to turn my camera off and hand it over to the town.
Hi, thank you, Andrew. So Gwen Miller, happy to be here and tell you a bit about our regional MVP project, the Housatonic Stream Restoration.
Gwen, I think we're having a little trouble hearing you.
Oh,
just be
okay.
There, that sounds better.
Now you can hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. I think I just have to speak very closely to my microphone. Okay. So happy to be here today and to share our regional MVP action project, the Housatonic Stream Restoration for Regional Flood Resilience Project. And I'm so glad to be joined by two of our partner organizations, the Housatonic Valley Association and Green Acres. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with our project in a nutshell, and this is the description from the MVP summary. In a nutshell, we are 4 communities who are conducting culvert assessments of approximately 400 culvert or stream crossings, and each community will get a replacement design culvert. And obviously the main goal of this is to increase our resilience for flood risk, which we know from all of our collective MVP planning efforts is one of our large concerns in the Berkshires and in these local communities. And a unique feature to this project is our youth, the youth participation, youth from environmental justice, working with compensation, with Green Agers, are conducting the assessments themselves. And I see the chat. Let me switch to my phone. I'm going to switch to my phone audio.
Okay. Yeah, whenever you're looking to your left or right, we can totally hear you just fine.
I'm not going to be able to keep track of that. Let me just dial in.
Is yeah, we're a little technical difficulty. We're going to get it resolved. We can make this work. Okay. Our official timekeeper is telling us that we have some slack in the schedule because we're ahead of schedule. So if anybody wants to go grab some water or something, this would probably be a good time.
Okay, can everyone hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can currently.
Okay, I'm using my phone instead of my laptop microphone. Okay, so let me just, I'm not sure what everybody heard. So our project in a nutshell is a community-wide culvert assessment. Okay, all right. Our project in a nutshell is a community-wide culvert assessment in 4 communities. And we're each going to get a culvert redesign for our priority kind of issue culverts in each community. And there's several unique features to this project. A, it's a 2-year project. B, it's very regional. 3 of the communities are next door to each other. And the other, New Marlborough, is over an hour away from Pittsfield, Lenox, and Stockbridge. But it encompasses the true Housatonic River watershed in the Berkshires. There are youth involved in many ways. They're performing the culvert assessments themselves, and they're also learning about climate change and climate resilience and youth leadership in the school. And we have our RPA, the Berkshire Regional Planning Commission, doing a lot of the program, project, and grant management and administration, which has been so invaluable to this project. Our grant award, the total over 2 years, is $295,190. And the match being provided really varies from like how we're providing the match at the community level and at the organizational level. Next slide, please. And my assistant's name is Orla, and she is 7 months old, so please be patient if you hear lots of squealing and noise in the background. And I also wanted to give you a brief overview. Hopefully you all know where the Berkshires are, but this map gives you a good idea. And like I said, not all of our communities are even next door to each other. We're all sharing the same watershed, and we were all in different stages of either our MVP planning or our MVP implementation. Some of us, I think Stockbridge was still working on their plan. Pittsfield had been an MVP community longer. And we're all providing staff hours as matched to this project. And Lenox, kind of, we are the lead community in serving kind of as the fiscal, like the fiscal arm of it. Next slide, please. And we have so the major piece of this is our is the nonprofit organizations who are helping us make this such an amazing, rich MVP project. So we have BRPC, who's kind of managing us and steering the ship and making sure all of it is happening to schedule and keeping us on track. HVA, the Housatonic Valley Association, is providing training and outreach and expertise. Green Agers is doing the field work. And another cool piece of this project is we have the youth engagement, but we're also hoping to incorporate some like historic flood knowledge and stories from seniors in the community. And like Green Agers will be helping collect that narrative information. Mass Audubon is doing the education in the schools along with HVA. UConn is conducting kind of the desktop analysis for flood risk failure of the road crossings. Everything is being done to the NAACC standard. And Trout Unlimited is working on LiDAR analysis and using other information to help come up with the nature-based design solutions for the culvert replacement. So there's a lot going on. And I'd say our partners, they're not just doing one thing, everyone's doing it's a multi-pronged approach. So next slide, please. And I thought I would just share a little bit of our municipal perspective. We began our MVP planning process in April 2019. And about a year later, we completed it and became an MVP community. And we were really excited to do the planning process. Resilience and climate change was really on our minds. We had some recent really big weather events that had significantly damaged some important infrastructure in the community. On the day of our stakeholder workshop, which was really well attended, people woke up without power or heat due to a significant wind event. And then the pandemic really woke people up to like, how can we still be a cohesive, strong, and adaptable community with so many unknowns and a greater likelihood of that, like challenging things happening in the future. And what we've been doing over time in Lennox particularly is we're really trying to catalog the location, age, and condition of all of our varied infrastructure. I think our water department foreman really summarized it best. You don't want to be looking for a water line or a sewer line when there's like 3 feet of snow on the ground and it's -10. You want to know where it is. And I'll also I want to say too, I'm the town planner, but it was really our water department foreman who really led the local planning effort and led the grant effort too to begin with. I was either getting ready or out on maternity leave for a lot of the initial effort. And so it was cool to see how we could spread the planning across departments in our own municipality. So when we became an MVP community, we got connected with the Housatonic Valley Association and Allison through BRPC, and we tried to apply for a culvert assessment grant through MVP. We were not successful, and so we kind of sat back for a little bit. And then the following year, we wanted to apply again, and we were really encouraged to do so by our regional coordinator, Carrie Ann Petrick. And this time, we were given some really clear and good feedback about how to make a stronger application. And we started way earlier in the process, convening partners, identifying our municipal partners to make it a truly regional project. And having everyone really identify what they could contribute to the project and how we could make it a really rich, sustainable in all the ways project. So the second time, it snowballed in the best way to make this really cool program and scope of work and a strong application as well. Next slide, please. And this leads me to some municipal lessons learned. I think time is always your friend in identifying partnerships, in seeing what the partnerships will entail, creating the program, and then in the actual application process, and of course in the grant management itself. I think we often take for granted how much time it takes to prepare a successful application and then manage the grant itself and the program. We think outside the box in terms of partnerships and your regional approach. As I've kind of reiterated, you don't have to be next door neighbors to work together. Think at the landscape and watershed scale. There's probably something going on in your community or region that you can leverage. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. The wheels are probably there, and just think about how you can work them into your project or your program. And I think too, I was thinking about this getting ready for today. A lot of stuff lands in the land use department or the planning office. We have a lot of tools, and our town halls and city halls have a lot of tools, but sometimes the capacity might not be there, or the certain expertise might not be there. Don't be afraid to look outside of your own office or your own town hall and to see what's in your town or your region, and like what's already happening, what expertise is out there. I think that's been a valuable lesson. And just thinking about how we're working with the RTA, it's been so invaluable to have this keep plugging along. And then also one thing that Ilya will talk about, some people were skeptical about having youth do the assessment work. I will say in Lennox, I did not have that feeling. In our long-term planning efforts, we really try to engage the youth, like they're who we're planning for, so they're a really critical stakeholder. Thinking about our master plan or trying to make our built environment friendly for everybody. So next slide, please. So I think there's been some important seeds planted for the future. We have strong relationships with a lot of these partners for future efforts. It's definitely building local capacity in all of the communities, and I hope in our partner organizations. I think there's an interesting pipeline being created from the youth in Green Agers or the youth in the middle and high school and even elementary programs, getting them interested in resiliency and how they can be involved with their municipalities and communities, either as volunteers or professional staff. Identifying community liaisons for this project and future efforts. It's a replicable methodology and approach that I really hope to see replicated in the Berkshires and across the state. I think if you have a youth organization or a workforce development program in your community or region, this would be a good fit. And obviously, the screen is cutting it off, but resilience. We're just building flood resilience. We're building a social network. We're making community connections towards overall climate resilience. And with that, I'm going to mute myself and Orla and pass it on to Ilya from Green Agers.
Hi, Gwen. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Gwen. My name is Ilya Domlino. I'm the Conservation Director at Green Agers. Green Agers is a little nonprofit based in the southwest corner of Massachusetts and Berkshire County. Our whole thing is providing jobs for youth in our community. So traditionally, that's taken the form of hiring them to build and fix hiking trails on local conservation properties, land trust properties, state forests, places like that. Increasingly, we're hiring youth to work in farms in our area. We have paid internships for youth to learn about the trades, so carpentry programs, things of that nature. And we have an educational program that works in middle and high schools to teach youth about climate change primarily, and providing them with hands-on opportunities. So the question was when this opportunity came to us, which program did this fall under? Next slide, please. And the natural fit seemed to be the Trails and Conservation Program, which for the large part just builds and fixes hiking trails. And you can see some of the program numbers from this past season. They're a little depressed because of COVID, but that'll give you an indication of what we get up to on a yearly basis. Most of the work happens over summer vacation for high school students. That's when we get I'd say 90% of the work done, but there are shoulder season crews in the fall and the spring, and these are usually youth taking a gap year between high school and college, or perhaps they went to college and they're a little uncertain as to what they want to study, so they're taking a year off, between their freshman or sophomore years. And this culvert crew, or as we like to call them, our stream troopers, they came from 3 environmental justice communities and one from just outside of one in Lenox, one in Sheffield, and one in Great Barrington. I'll say that the work season was very short this past fall. We only got the contract together, in September. So our field season was September, October. So to recruit, hire, train, and get them all out in the field was a challenge, but a challenge that we were able to rise to, fortunately. Next slide, please. And just to give folks an indication or an idea of what this crew was doing, on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see the data sheet that they were out essentially measuring these road crossing infrastructure or culverts for. So there's about 50 different metrics they're capturing, including location and the dimensions of these structures, what they're made of, what the substrate looks like, both upstream through it on the downstream side. Essentially, we can get into that a little bit in the Q&A portion if you'd like, but I just wanted to give you all an idea. And on the right-hand side, this is a map of Pittsfield, and it's probably difficult to see, but you might be able to pick out the bits of text scattered around that map. Everywhere you see the text, there's actually a small dot that shows you where a culvert is. So over the 2-year grant period, we're tasked with surveying about approximately 400 culverts in the 4 communities we're working in. And I'll also say that Trout Unlimited is taking one of the towns, the town of New Marlborough. So the Green Agers youth component is working in Pittsfield, Lenox, and Stockbridge. Next slide, please. So I saw in the chat there was a question about recruitment. Fortunately, we've been around for about 9 years now, going on 10 years in our community in Berkshire County. So we have a lot of ties with these communities already through high schools, community colleges. You can see the list there, some organizations that work with youth and at-risk youth already. So we, have this structure in place, fortunately. So despite the very short window for recruitment, we're able to actually get a really productive crew out in the field. And then the training, which was absolutely essential and provided expertly by the Housatonic Valley Association, and Allison Dixon will speak next, was entertaining for the youth, to say the least. It was great, very productive, and a different skill set than what they're used to doing at Green Acres, which is mostly kind of digging in the earth and moving buckets of soil to build hiking trails. Next slide, please. So some of the outcomes from this past fall, and again, very short window of work, but everybody on the crew is now a lead observer in the North Atlantic Aquatic Connectivity Collaborative, or NAC, which is a 13-state kind of coalition. So this survey is being used up and down the mid-Atlantic to New England area. So these surveys, you go anywhere in this 13-state area, and they're doing the same surveys, which is pretty neat. They were able to survey 34 road stream crossings. They got about 320 hours of youth employment. So all these youth were paid for what they did. And we engaged, of course, the communities I mentioned, as well as Egremont and Mount Washington, where we did some of the training only because those towns are right next to our headquarters. And like I said, this is just a brand new opportunity for the youth that we engage with. You know, this was something that we've been trying to develop at Green Agers, some sort of career path that trends more towards, you know, public works or environmental engineering, natural resources management, that side of the career spectrum. Next slide, please. And finally, some lessons learned. Without our existing partnerships in the community through youth organizations and educational institutes, we wouldn't have been able to recruit, train, and get this group out there. Some of the youth, I'll say, and this is really important, some of the youth, they were into this, they really dug it. And, you know, I think it's gonna put their career trajectory on kind of a new path, but not all loved this work. Some people found themselves longing for the days of you know, bushwhacking through the woods and bringing a pick-matic over their shoulder to the work site. And that's okay. You know, I think it was just as important that youth learned, you know, that this isn't perhaps what they are passionate about, you know, going out and collecting environmental data. And you know, I don't think that should be underplayed by any means. It took longer than we thought it would to get the contract together and get the crew out there. So this first season, I think we probably overestimated how much we could get done in that time period. And, you know, I think that's just a very important lesson learned for me. We were still able to get a lot done, but we've got a ton more to do in the coming years. And finally, consistent communication across all of these partnerships that Gwen mentioned, whether it be municipal, city, or nonprofit. That was key to what we did. So I'm gonna introduce now Allison Dixon, who's featured here in the photo with the high-vis vest on the right-hand side there. Allison is a tremendous mentor to youth, including myself when I was youth. And she helped train up our crew. So I'll hand it over to Allison.
Thank you, Aaliyah. And yes, I am excited to be here. I'm very excited about this project. HVA, Housatonic Valley Association, is the watershed organization for the Housatonic River, and we encompass parts of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York. And I have the Massachusetts portion of the watershed. That's my area. And we are perfectly situated as a watershed organization to help develop such a regional action grant. And our MVP regional coordinator was a huge nudge. I think these coordinators are excellent resources and do use them, and they push you, they challenge you to really get this going. It was a lot of work to pull together. We had lots of partners, and yet we were very aware as a watershed organization that our MVP communities had realized that their culvert infrastructure was vulnerable, and we as an organization have been working with many communities up and down the watershed to create what we call road stream crossing management plans. So this regional action grant was a perfect fit for the watershed organization, and we really serve as a thread through the whole grant. But again, the requirements of the action grant really pushes you to consider doing things differently, to create new partnerships, and really stretches you out of your comfort zone. It can challenge you. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, one of the outcomes, really the key outcome, is the road stream crossing management plans. And along the way, we do intend to do lots of outreach and education. Gwen mentioned the school programs we are doing with Mass Audubon in the grant towns, the communities. We do watershed curriculum. It's water, from the water cycle to human impacts, teaching about green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, and water quality. So we go into the 5th grade multiple times, and Mass Audubon is going into 3rd grade and 7th grade, and even doing high school programs. So there's a huge school program component. But even as we do our culvert assessments out in the field, that is a great opportunity to engage the community through landowner outreach. When you're out assessing a culvert, you are invariably going to need to go on private property. So we do send letters out to property owners adjacent to the culverts, and there are often culverts on a private property, and we want to assess those too. For the component of the road stream crossing management plan, the flood risk modeling. And so there's a huge opportunity to let the community know about the project and why it's important. We'll be including a fact sheet with our landowner outreach. And invariably, people come out and talk to you, and they might participate in the assessment, and we will be reaching out and sharing opportunities that people can actually assess a crossing and see how the process goes. So our road stream crossing management plans that HVA has been doing for the last at least 2 years, going on 3, includes the field assessment, the culvert assessment, flood risk modeling on any closed bottom structures by Yukon Engineering. So that partnership was already in place. And Trout Unlimited assists with the preliminary design. We use their engineers. So we go through a prioritization process with the town, getting their input and getting the flood risk input, and putting together a prioritization where we can rank the replacement of projects. And so that the town has a map for where it makes most sense to replace those crossings, and how to move forward. And we continue to help them along the way with raising funds to complete the culvert replacement. And the top priority crossing for each community, we do field surveys and work with the engineer to complete a preliminary design package. The italicized words indicate where we have altered our road stream crossing management plans for this action grant. As you heard from Aaliyah, we're using their expertise and in engaging youth to actually do these assessments. And I have to say that was the best experience of 2021, is working with the Green Agers youth crew. They were incredible youth. I've never had so much fun, and they did a phenomenal job. There was hesitancy on HVA's part, not mine, but maybe my supervisors, how well the youth will do. And they came, they did an excellent job, and we expect that to continue. And the other piece that we have added is the nature-based solutions analysis by Trout Unlimited and HVA. And again, Green Agers is involved with that, where we go to every culvert location. Generally, there is stormwater input at these locations. This is an opportunity to gather information about what's going on with that stormwater, and also looking upstream and even downstream at where is there potential for restoration, where is there severe erosion happening, what is the vegetative cover adjacent to the rivers. So we will be using Trout Unlimited's expertise with LiDAR analysis and pulling information from the observations from the Green Agers youth crew to really provide some input to the towns on some future projects that will move them to climate resilience, even beyond just culvert replacements. And I think the takeaway from this project for HVA is really, and we've all heard the saying, it takes a community to raise a child. And I think of the child in this case is our need to have greater resilience in each community. And the community is all the people and the organizations that are serving your region and watershed. And it will take those partnerships to really work together to greatly improve the climate resilience in our towns. And I will leave it at that. Thank you for your time.
Right. So thank you so much for, Gwen, for sharing your wonderful child with us. I think it's so appropriate that, one of the main focuses of this is that we're talking about youth engagement and youth involvement in climate adaptation projects. And here we have a youth getting involved in the presentation, so that's a good thing. So, I've been in the past 2 years, I've had my kids climbing on my shoulders in the middle of presentations. And so I know how hard it can be. And I have to say, you were much more clear and direct than I ever was when I had my little one climbing all over me. So kudos to you, hats off. So lots of support and love from everybody for that. So we have some questions about just the mechanics. So in general, people are interested in how these communities recruited youth and recruited youth and EJ populations to conduct culvert assessments.
I can take that, Andrew. That's right. So I'll say that, like I said in the presentation, Green Agers has these existing partnerships with community organizations. You can hear my toddler in the background there. So without those partnerships, we wouldn't have been able to recruit this youth crew in the amount of time we had to get all of this work done. So I just can't stress it enough. These partnerships with and relationships, longstanding relationships with teachers in our high schools, teachers in our community colleges, professionals and staff at youth organizations. I mentioned, or I bullet pointed, Railroad Street Youth Project, which is a fantastic organization in Great Barrington, Volunteers in Medicine, Berkshire County, which again is in Great Barrington. So we have these, existing partnerships, and then, we put the word out to them. And, I show up and do my dog and pony show. And that's how recruitment goes for all of our crews, for that matter.
So yeah, I think this ties back to something Gwen said in the very beginning, which is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, that sometimes you find these networks and you tap into them. So what was the aha moment that you guys had collectively that made you realize you could create opportunities for youth employment within the context of adapting to climate change? You mentioned our colleague, Carrie Ann Petrick, which is great because we like to see it, love for our colleagues. How did that process go when you guys put those pieces together and realized you could and create something that was kind of new and different?
I know I've been talking to Aaliyah for quite a few years about partnering up to have youth crews, not necessarily for culvert assessments, but for maintaining green infrastructure, learning about green infrastructure, and even implementing them. So I don't feel like I ever had an aha moment. It was just an obvious, especially Aaliyah he's trained in these culvert assessments. That was my first meeting of him, is taking him out as a volunteer and teaching him about culvert assessments. So there was already existing relationship and knowledge. So for me, I don't know if it was ever an aha.
Cool.
Yeah, I would have to say, I don't know if there was a specific moment, but one cool thing about living and working in the Berkshires is it's kind of a tight knit and smaller like network. So I think we were one day, part of the time commitment to working on this whole program and application, we met weekly for like a month or two, maybe longer, to kind of iron out, to really get at the nuts and bolts of the scope of work and how everything would be delivered and implemented. And at some point we were all wondering, like, how would the organizations involved have the capacity to do all of the assessments? And somebody suggested we bring Green Agers in, and it just worked out so perfectly.
Nice.
And I'll just say one last thing. The one kind of realization I came to was, why haven't we done this before? Like, as soon as it got off the ground, it felt like such a natural, organic thing, and everything just worked. Yeah. That I was kind of kicking myself for not doing this years before.
That's good. I'm right there with you. So yeah, so I think that I think that's a lesson, is tap into your networks, make those connections. Don't worry about reinventing the wheel. And sometimes the idea is always there. And we from the MVP program are just fortunate that we get to work with you in implementing your ideas, So it's nice that you guys are doing your work. We're just here to help share the message around the Commonwealth. So there is some questions. So around youth in particular. So what is the takeaway for the youth that are engaging in these types of projects that's beyond like exposure to the community or transferable skills? So do they get like specific guidance on how to reflect that in a resume, how to sort of reorient their career pathway, things like that?
Sure. So with the caveat that we've only been doing this specific project for about 2 months, we do provide for all of our youth resume.
I think we lost Aaliyah. Can anybody else
building workshops and kind of sales? So the youth work.
So I think we're losing you there. So it sounds like you do provide resume support and like sort of career training support. Is that consistent, Allison and Gwen? Could you guys kind of back Aaliyah up on that data point?
I can't really speak to it, but I am sure they do. They definitely do training. Did you come back yet? No. You could go to the next slide. That has our contact information if anybody wants.
Get from there. We'll probably come back to it later in our kind of group panel on the implementation stuff. So yeah, I really am glad. Oh, sorry.
We've thought too about helping to get some of the guys or girls who have been doing the assessments. We're hoping in the spring we can have some field trips to our water plant and the wastewater treatment facility in Lenox. And we know we'll be looking for some paid staff support in the spring and summer months too. And we thought at first we could have some of them shadow some of our staff. But that was getting into some tricky like safety and union concerns. But we're hoping that we can work with Ilya and Green Agers to hopefully, if there's a right candidate or individual, see if they can actually do some work for the town. And that would be a competitive application process. So there would be some learning there, like working on a resume and interview skills and stuff like that. And I think Green Agers does do that. Like they do such good work. It's really incredible.
Awesome. So I think we have to move on for the matters of time right now. Can we go next slide? So thank you so much. You guys are rock stars. I appreciate it. So now we're going to go to a little bit farther to the east on the other side of the state, which is the Mystic River watershed. So we're going to look into critical regional infrastructure and social vulnerability in the lower Mystic watershed. We are officially 1 minute behind schedule, I think. So I think we're doing okay. I think we're on track. So it's nice to know that we're hitting the benchmarks that we wanted to hit. So we're very fortunate. We've got some great speakers. Let me pull up their bios real quick. 1 second. We have Melanie Gatti. I apologize if I didn't pronounce that exactly correctly. That's my fault, but I'm trying. So Melanie is the Climate Resiliency Manager for the Mystic River Watershed Association in the Boston area. At Myra, she works with municipal staff, community-based organizations, public health officials, local residents to increase regional climate resiliency. With community equity and health as a priority, she focuses on enhancing climate solutions within the watershed via nature-based solutions and social change. Prior to working for Myra, Melanie focused on coastal conservation and environmental education in the greater Boston area at Mass Audubon and the New England Aquarium. Melanie holds a master's degree in marine ecology and climate change from the University of Rhode Island, where she obtained an NSF graduate research fellowship to study mangrove ecology and perform community outreach in Puerto Rico. That sounds so fun and cool. We also have Zoe Davis from the city of Boston, representing the Municipal Perspective on this awesome regional project. And we have Dr. Atia Martin, who is the CEO and founder of All ACES. And that's an alternative to traditional diversity, equity, and inclusion for consulting firms. Her personal mission is to unleash the invisible power that every person and organization has to intentionally act to disrupt oppression. Dr. Martin has over 20 years of experience in applying the principles of racial equity and social justice during her career in resilience, emergency management, public health, and intelligence. Dr. Martin is published in scholarly journals and is the author of We Are the Question and the Answer: Break the Collective Habit of Racism and Build Resilience for Racial Equity in Ourselves and Our Organizations. Additionally, she is a distinguished senior fellow at Northeastern University's Global Resilience Institute. So we're very fortunate. And Dr. Martin is a certified emergency manager with an Associate of Arts in Serbian Croatian from the Defense Language Institute, Bachelor of Science from Excelsior College, Master of Homeland Security Leadership from the University of Connecticut, and a Doctor of Law in Policy from Northeastern University. Dr. Martin and her husband were born and raised in Boston, where they currently live with their 5 children, 2 of whom are still at home. So we have a great panel to bring out for our last speakers and presenters for the day. And off we go.
Thanks so much, Andrew, for such a great introduction. Really, really honored to be amongst all of these powerful people centering climate resilience and people in their work. So now we're going to hop over to the East Coast on Massachusetts and Pawtucket traditional lands, otherwise known as the Boston area. And I'll be going over the Lower Mystic regional vulnerability assessments that are data and equity driven. Next slide. I'll first give you a bird's eye view as to how this project came to be and really go over our little brainchild, the Resilient Mystic Collaborative. We'll report out what we learned and where we're going from there, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions. Next slide. And so, as we all know, climate change impacts have no boundaries. One of those impacts is flooding. And water, especially with flooding, especially from storms and sea level rise, is stubborn. It is persistent. And so it wants to go where it wants to go. And so water remembers its floodplains. And if we think about solutions to building those climate impacts in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we have a major governance challenge because we don't have a regional functioning county state systems similar to California or down south. And so for perspective, the size of the Mystic River watershed is almost the size of Amsterdam, both in just scope and then also the amount of people living within that area. Another great example is comparing it to Brooklyn, New York. And so it's a relatively small area, but with many, many municipalities, 21 municipalities, and over 500,000 people living within that area. And so next slide. To tackle this regional challenge, the Mystic River Watershed Association and the municipalities within this area created and founded the Resilient Mystic Collaborative, or the RMC. And so this is a voluntary partnership of 20 cities and towns. It's about 90% of the watershed. And this was really directed towards figuring out how to tackle climate resilience at a regional scale for both people and place. This is a really important way to deepen municipal partnerships for the years ahead. So as climate change gets worse and worse, we're able to create solutions together instead of in silos. Next slide. And so with major storms already occurring and with more to come in both the near and the long term, one of the major issues that the RMC wanted to tackle is this flooding issue that we have across the lower part of our watershed. And so this map is showing a picture of the city of Chelsea. So you can see right in the middle, you can barely read out the city of Chelsea. To the left is Everett, and down to the south is the area of East Boston. And so I'm not sure if you can click the next slide. If it'll do, no, if you can go back to the other slide, I think when it transferred, it didn't do what I wanted it to do. But if you can imagine what this area looks like now in 2022, just picture a bunch of people, a bunch of buildings, and a bunch of critical infrastructure, such as the airport in East Boston, the New England Food and Produce Center in Chelsea. And what I want you to look at is right in the center where it says Chelsea, and then to the left of it, there's this curving river that is going up north. This is Island and River, and what's left of it today is just a little tiny minuscule area. And so as you can imagine, this is a major flood pathway that has socially vulnerable people, environmental justice populations, as well as critical infrastructure. Next slide. And so if we look at the lower Mystic part of the watershed, which is outlined in red right here, you can see that the area in gray shows the annual percent probability of flooding in 2070. And so the areas in gray have a greater than 90% chance of severe flooding every year or every 18 months. And so you can imagine the significant impact that flooding would cause not only to the infrastructure that we need to survive on a daily basis, but also to the people who need all of that critical infrastructure. Next. And so if we think about all of the stuff and all of the people that's there, we need to think about how do we manage it all? What do we need to figure out? How are storms going to impact this area? What is going to flood? How are we going to communicate? And then also what happens to the people? And how do we create equitable outcomes for them too, with the understanding that unless you're intentional, equitable outcomes for people never happen by accident. Next slide. And so this brings us to one of the first projects of the RMC, funded by MVP with municipal sponsor Somerville, called the Lower Mystic Regional Climate Assessment. That is really novel in its pursuit because it includes what is traditionally done in vulnerability assessments for climate impacts, which is creating a functional exercise to involve all the stakeholders within there, creating a fake or hypothetical storm to seeing what breaks. And that is amazing to try to understand what is going to happen. But then we also added the social vulnerability assessment in parallel. And so we're adding the social vulnerability assessment to shift the central question from where is the most money at risk to who actually stands to lose the most, who is most vulnerable, how are they impacted, and how can we create an equity-centered solutions approach. Next slide. And so really quickly, Zoe and Dr. Martin will get into the details of each of the vulnerability assessments, but overall, first we had to identify what DHA's critical lifelines there are. The facilities were needing to do self-assessments to make sure to protect their information. Then we coordinated and created a Big Poppy functional exercise. Big Poppy was the name of the hypothetical nor'easter heavy hitter. On the social vulnerability end, the team at All ACEs, led by Dr. Martin, did a link analysis, which you'll go over. The community participated in surveys in all of the municipalities involved, and that led to an equity-based assessment. And so I'll pass it over to Zoe Davis from the City of Boston to go over the infrastructure vulnerability part of the assessment.
Thanks, Melody. So the research question that was explored during the critical infrastructure part of this assessment was what critical infrastructure is at risk from a 2050 1% coastal storm? Again, the theoretical name of this storm, Big Poppy. So infrastructure and emergency managers agreed to test their facilities with a projected 2050 1% annual chance slow-moving winter nor'easter. And such a storm is projected to be approximately 2.5 feet higher than the 1% annual chance storms that were experienced in 2018, both due to sea level rise and to increasing coastal storm intensity. This represented a storm event that could plausibly happen today, but was also consequential enough to represent unprecedented flood conditions in the greater Boston area. And so this projected storm was chosen for two reasons. The first is that nor'easters tend to be slower moving, so storm surges can hit multiple times during the daily high tides. And the second reason that winter storm nor'easters tend to be the strongest storms in this region, and so they present additional challenges, including extreme cold, snow, and ice. Next slide, please. So this is an image of the Lower Mystic. You can see the assessment area highlighted in green. As Melanie had pointed out earlier, this includes Chelsea, Everett, Somerville, Revere, Winthrop, and Charlestown and East Boston, which are neighborhoods of the city of Boston. Next slide, please. The Lower Mystic watershed contains the highest concentration of critical infrastructure, as well as the highest concentration of environmental justice residents in the New England area. But although these critical community lifelines, the critical infrastructure facilities are physically concentrated in the Lower Mystic, the extent of their services and their impact extend well beyond the region. So some of the critical facilities located in the region include what Melanie had mentioned before within the food sector, the New England Produce Center, looking at wastewater, Deer Island, a myriad of critical facilities within the transportation sector, looking at the airport, the T subway and commuter rails, various ports, I-93, many other surface roads. It includes energy, looking at the oil terminals and the transfer stations, and the dam, particularly looking at Amelia Earhart Dam. Next slide, please. So the facilities that I mentioned, they serve as community lifelines. These are defined by FEMA as infrastructure that enables the continuous operation of critical government and business functions and is essential to human health and safety or economic security. And so these lifelines are the most fundamental services in the community, and that when stabilized, they enable all other aspects of society to function. Next slide. And here, these are the critical infrastructure sectors that are recognized by the the Department of Homeland Security as community lifelines, and the sectors that are highlighted in red represent those that participated in the infrastructure assessment. So healthcare and public health, the transportation systems, water, food, government energy, emergency services, and the dams. Next slide. So coming back to this research question, which critical infrastructure is at risk? What critical infrastructure is at risk from a 2050 1% coastal storm? The project team designed and facilitated a functional exercise with critical infrastructure facilities, and then completed an analysis to identify the site-specific and cascading impacts by the storm scenario. So the first step in this process was back in 2018, meeting with the Department of Homeland Security, their Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, DHS CISA for short, to advise on how the assessment overall could be structured and what the functional exercise could include. This was followed by almost a year of one-on-one meetings, really a journey of trust building through 2019 with infrastructure managers, state and federal emergency managers, as well as outside experts from other cities, really to ground truth the scenarios and ensure that the exercise was realistically challenging. And then moving into 2020, the Resilient Mystic Collaborative was able to secure funding through the MVP program and bring on a project team, as well as confirm participation of the critical infrastructure facility managers in the functional exercise. And after that, the infrastructure assessment began. First, the facility managers completed a self-assessment to assess their own vulnerabilities of the buildings that they managed. And this self-assessment tool was developed by the New York City Mayor's Office of Recovery and Resilience, and we adapted it to our purposes. And it was provided alongside a flood viewer developed by Woods Hole Group based on the selected storm scenario. And then following this assessment, the facilities participated in the functional exercise itself. Next slide, please. So there was a total of 13 critical facilities that participated in the exercise, as well as 20 municipal, state, and federal and nonprofit organizations that helped to develop and staff this exercise. And the key objectives of the exercise were, of course, to identify the key impacts of critical infrastructure or of flooding to the critical infrastructure, but also to determine the points of coordination and information that are needed between critical facilities over the duration of an extreme weather event, as well as to identify provisions for critical facilities workers themselves. So as part of this exercise, we had CBS Boston's own chief meteorologist, Eric Fisher, who created mock daily weather briefings, and MEMA's state hazard mitigation officer, at the time Sarah White, who recorded mock daily situational updates from MEMA's Framingham bunker. You can see them on the screen here. These were a part of the briefing in each of the modules of the exercise to help participants move through pre-storm preparation to post-storm recovery. Next slide, please. And so looking at some of our key findings of the analysis, the project team found that facilities that would sustain substantial damage that would require considerable time and cost for repair included the Amelia Earhart Dam, the harbor tunnels, the blue and orange lines, as well as the community health centers. And as for key emergency response needs, the project team found that a storm of this magnitude would incur a significant amount of flooding. So managing that flooding to prevent damage from floodwaters alone would be critical to recovery and moving forward. And additionally, there was widespread reliance on emergency generators across critical facilities to help those facilities stay running. And then finally, communication with MEMA, as well as communication between facilities, was really critical for information and coordination overall. So with that, I am going to pass the mic over to Dr. Martin to walk us through the social vulnerability assessment.
Thank you, Zoe. I appreciate you. And so this was an amazing experience. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Melanie. And thank you to my colleagues who are on today, particularly Maddie Chisholm, who played a big role in our ability to support this project. And so for the social vulnerability piece, we really were looking at some key pieces, which is if infrastructure fails, how does that actually impact people who are socially vulnerable? And we also use the language of priority populations. And for context, not because some people are more important than other people, but it challenges us to look at the most complex needs and situations in our planning scenarios, and how we think about the impacts and how we think about opportunities to take mitigative prevention and response and recovery efforts. And so it makes us look at the things that we oftentimes don't look at because it's easier not to. And to Melanie's point earlier, in absence of being intentional about embedding equity, it does not happen. And so by virtue, we unintentionally perpetuate inequities without meaning to do so. And if we move forward to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the overview of the project timeline. And so we started out really looking at the fact that we knew we were going to be connecting the dots of what was happening on the social vulnerability side with what was the impacts of critical infrastructure. And so in parallel with what was happening with preparation for the Big Poppy exercise and analysis, as well as the social vulnerability analysis, we really wanted to lay a strong foundation. And so we conducted what's called a link analysis, or you may have heard of network analysis, or some people have seen social network analyses, where we really looked to the literature. And we said, based on what the literature says about how socially vulnerable populations or priority populations are impacted by different types of infrastructure disruptions, here are some of the potential outcomes and scenarios we need to be looking at. And so that link analysis, which is included in the report, which in hindsight would have been helpful for you all to see today, but you can see it in the actual report, but really looking at how can we focus our energy, considering that the world is so big when it comes to all the infrastructure and all of the categories of people who are within the context of priority populations, or to use other language as well, environmental justice communities. And so when we're thinking about who different people are and what their differences in dependency on critical infrastructure are, it really helped us to narrow the scope of the world so that we can develop a social vulnerability assessment process that was going to yield us some tangible outputs. And so based on that link analysis and looking at what the research said about all these pieces and visualizing it, we were able to identify that when energy and transportation in particular were disrupted, that we knew that there were these specific impacts for priority populations. And this is kind of one of the biggest findings of the link analysis. And that was the impact of energy and transportation on people's ability to get to childcare or get access to childcare, which impacted their employment, which impacted their income. And energy and transportation therefore also impacts businesses. And it's this reciprocal relationship that better integrates what we often see as siloed things. We oftentimes think of socially vulnerable populations as kind of a small group over here, when in fact, when you look at the the categories: people of color, people with disabilities, the whole range of disabilities, so physical disabilities all the way through to cognitive, sensory disabilities. When you look at immigrant populations, when you look at low-income communities, it's really a larger percentage of people in our communities than we oftentimes give credit for. And at the national level, the research shows that it's over 50% of the US population can be considered socially vulnerable in that way. And so when we see this relationship between socially vulnerable populations and critical infrastructure and those impacts, then it allowed us to create a survey and a series of focus groups. And those surveys and focus groups were done in partnership with community partners. So community-based organizations, and I'll tell you who they were: La Comunidad, Harbor Keepers, Green Roots, CAS in Somerville CDC, TCGT Entertainment. And we actually, as all ACEs, and in the spirit of the actual project, put about 40% of our budget towards subcontracting with community-based organizations. So they were our true partners in this process. And so we met regularly with them to really challenge our assumptions and make sure that we were not just looking to data and research to prepare for this project, that it was ground truth through our community-based partners. And so through our community-based partners, we were able to deploy a survey that connected the dots between critical infrastructure disruptions and people's day-to-day lives, and what their experiences had been based on using some things from COVID-19 as proxies, because it was present in people's mind, and some very specific scenarios related to flooding risk, and scenarios that would help people in communities who aren't in the middle of this, like practitioners like us on here, to be able to share information, meaningful information that would inform this process. And the survey was available in English, Spanish, Portuguese, Haitian Creole, and Chinese. We also had 3 focus groups, 2 in English and 1 in Spanish. As a result of all of that effort, we were able to get over 400 surveys completed across the 6 different communities that we partnered with, including for Boston, East Boston, and Charlestown. And within those surveys, we found some very interesting results. And if we move forward to the next slide, we can see how some of the understandings of underlying risk factors were a part of this, as well as kind of getting more nuanced understanding of the infrastructure vulnerabilities as it relates to people's real life experiences. And so that brings us to several lessons that we learned. So one is the kind of limited English proficiency in this particular area, and people of color and low income communities kind of really were, as we knew at going in, were kind of people who were bearing the brunt of the burden of climate change. And those are the same folks that we connected with intentionally through our community-based partners for the survey. They were concentrated predominantly in East Boston, Chelsea, Revere, and Everett. And we also knew that there's a series of fragile mutual aid networks and community social infrastructure, and that some of the ideas that community members had about the capabilities of government to respond, to plan for climate emergencies and to respond to climate emergencies were not realistic. And so that led us to some pieces around the fact that priority populations are more dependent on public transportation and walking to get to where they need to go, whether it's work, school, shopping, healthcare, and that loss of mobility has significant impact on those things, as well as the social infrastructure that it contributes to the day-to-day resilience of communities, of people in communities. We also had the connection to how the ability to get places or limited ability to get places impacted people's economic security and their access to basic services, again, that are part of that foundation and foundational resilience that our community members really need. Mobile phone networks and the internet were critical sources of communication and connection and information for communities. And we know that mobile infrastructure is very closely tied to electricity, having access to electricity. And what's really important here is it is a main way that communities access the internet. And it doesn't mean they have everyone has a smartphone, because just to shift some of the thinking around that. I know we always want an app for that, but everyone doesn't have a smartphone. And so in reality, people are using, some people in our communities have kind of lower functioning, non-5G, 4G, or 3G phones where they're only able to access phone calls and internet. And so that really is an important social infrastructure lifeline that connects people to each other, that keeps people connected to each other. And again, that kind of household, individual, and community resilience that folks have built for themselves in spite of social challenges. So the other piece that I'll highlight here is the reliance on health centers, community health centers. So when we actually went through the list of all of the community health centers and local healthcare infrastructure in the 6 jurisdictions, and there really was a heavy reliance on community health centers by majority of the survey respondents. And we really kind of also wanted to highlight the fact that, there's this idea that individual responsibility for preparedness is what is the answer. And it's not enough, right? That in fact, it's the recognition of the more integrated, interdependent nature of how things actually work, right? That who I am and what I'm dealing with as an individual sits within the context of my community and what we have access to and don't have access to, and sits within the context of what my city is doing in partnership or not in partnership, or what resources we have or don't have access to. So all of that context matters. And so when we're thinking about preparedness, that the emergency preparedness workshops and things like that alone aren't enough to address the scale of challenges for priority populations. And so the last piece is kind of I mentioned earlier, this high expectation that government was clear about climate emergencies and response, and that, the government had it covered, particularly local government. And so this higher than average percentage or thinking around trust in government's ability to do that work. So this doesn't equate to trust in government. It equates to trust in government's ability to kind of know what's going on with climate change and do what's necessary to address it, and be able to respond, recover, and mitigate its impacts. And so, that also came out of this, and it was unclear why people felt that way. And we can only, I think, in reality, we would be speculating a little bit on the reasons, the details of why that is. But there's probably my speculation on that is probably related to messaging and how we talk about whose roles and responsibility it is to deal with climate change in general as a society, but also in terms of how we think about the way we put plans together and how we think about the ways that we deal with response and recovery, and who is involved or not involved in understanding and participating in decision-making in those processes. So that said, the last thing I'll say about this is one other thread or link in this that's really important is that helps to break down some of the silos that we have in how we think about critical infrastructure and people, is that of the over 400 people that were surveyed, almost 20% of them actually worked for an organization that falls within a critical infrastructure sector. So in other words, 1 in 5 of this very small sample size of 400 people from 6 jurisdictions, 1 in 5 of them actually worked in critical infrastructure, which has which we've seen some of those relationships more in present day as it relates to COVID-19. But I really want to lift that up as part of the conversation, that we're talking about people who are working within the very areas that we're dependent upon as a society and in this part of Massachusetts, but also that when we think about business continuity and we think about understanding what's going on with our employees and where they live and what challenges they're facing, that is integrated into the conversation, that actually priority populations are very interwoven into our critical infrastructure foundations. And that businesses and organizations, government who are in charge of critical infrastructure, if they are going to ensure that we all have access to what we need, that there's clarity and understanding who works for folks and what they need in order to be able to show up to work every day, particularly when there's an emergency. So I am now going to transition it back to Melanie and just say thank you to everyone. And it's been wonderful to partner on this project and all of the people involved to make it work.
Thank you, Dr. Martin and Zoe. And I know we're a little bit over time, so I'll make this quick summary or quick as possible. And so to touch upon the fact that this was a combined assessment, so holding both what happens to the infrastructure and what happens to the people, we put together what happens and what the critical findings are for both. And so one that Dr. Martin and Zoe went over is that there is in fact a high concentration of critical infrastructure and priority populations or vulnerable communities in East Boston, Chelsea, Everett, and Revere. Secondly, everybody is concerned about the ability to maintain communications in a disaster. So both the emergency managers who need to talk to one another and the communities on the ground and the municipalities and then everything in between, right? So how are we going to communicate? Everybody thinks that they're top of NEPA's list, but are they really? We also have a widespread reliance on emergency generators. And so if we have flooding near the fuel centers or at the fuel centers or where that fuel is being delivered, how are we going to actually make sure that those emergency generators run, right? Harbor tunnels, subway tunnels, dams will flood in this theoretical 2051% storm. And so what do we need to do to recover all of that? Many of these systems will take weeks, if not months, to fully repair because they depend on really custom-made parts. So you can't just go to your local, hardware or Home Depot to find a specific part for the T. Buses are a really important tool because they're more manageable and can be moved out of harm's way more easily than a whole railway. And then social vulnerable people are much more dependent on public transit, as Dr. Martin mentioned. Maintaining power and communications is critical. I think we've already talked about this. And then lastly, community health centers are really critical for priority populations, and they themselves are in critical vulnerable places, and so they are vulnerable to flooding. So how can people access their medication? What about folks who rely on electricity dependent health services? What will happen to both the infrastructure and to the people? So those were found to be critical. Next slide, please. I'll go through this really quickly, a few lessons learned. This whole project was a very big undertaking. So many community partners. It took many years for this to actually come to fruition. So make sure to incorporate time into your planning, which is always limited. Like everybody else, the pandemic made everything more difficult. And so we originally envisioned this whole project with being able to meet in person. Relying on community-based organizations is really incredible, but it's also very complicated, and we need to devote care and equity into developing those relationships, as well as incorporate them early on into the project, similarly to how we incorporated the infrastructure managers into the project. We have lots to learn about community intake instruments, how the actual way we deploy them, how we come up with the survey. We also did focus groups. Perhaps we could have done focus groups in the beginning to inform the survey, and so forth. There's also lots to be said about compensation for CBO. So Dr. Martin's team allotted 40%, as she mentioned, of their budget to CBOs, and it was also based on the populations within their individual municipalities. So we're thinking more equity rather than equal, similar to for COVID test kits per household, when that's not an accurate equality measure, perhaps. And then this is very important to also compensate the community members for their time and expertise. And so participants were compensated for their time with a gift card. Next slide. Where do we go from here? We need to create regional priorities for action. Next slide. And a couple of shovel-worthy projects that have come out of this report is definitely storm hardening the Amelia Earhart Dam that, if over flooded, would make the city of Malden and other municipalities tidal again. Making sure to storm harden the Island End River that cuts through Everett and Chelsea. Pay close attention to the MBTA blue line and create nature-based solutions, as well as gray solutions to protect their flooding, and the harbor tunnels, of course. Next slide. And so for the next year, in 2023, we hope to develop projects around that communications, the point around grid and cell resiliency, making sure to also look into buses and pedestrian resiliency. How can that be more equitable? And this idea around resilience hubs. How can we establish resiliency across communities with existing infrastructure where people normally go to, and create that climate-centered resilience? And also see what we can do with community health centers around their physical resilience and the resilience to people to make sure that they are able to stay healthy even and access healthcare even through a severe storm like this. Next slide. Thank you to all of our partners. Can't name you all, but you're all amazing. Thank you so much if you're in the audience. And next slide. Feel free to contact us if you have any more questions, and I'll put our emails and the RMC link in the chat. Thank you.
Perfect. In the interest of time, I'm going to try to jump right into questions. Could we advance to the next slide, please, Michelle? Oh, sorry, a few more, one more. I just want to make sure everybody's emails are up there for our presenters today. So I think we might skip the round robin and just go to some questions about this specific project, because we do want to be sensitive to people's times. Dr. Martin, could you talk about the impact of the pandemic in making outreach work a lot harder than perhaps you all had anticipated it would be?
For the sake of time, I won't go into the weeds because Melanie touched on it. What I will say is it meant that we also had to recognize, if you're working with community-based organizations, they work in communities. And so they are supporting people through the impacts of the pandemic. And so we really had to adjust ourselves to make sure that we are accommodating for the needs of even our community-based organizations, and how the fact that they were supporting community members and therefore busier than was originally anticipated at the beginning of the project. And in spite of all of that, they still were able to partner with us and really deliver and engage with folks and meet them where they were in the middle of the pandemic. So whatever work they were doing with communities already, they were embedding connections to the survey and recruiting people for focus groups as part of those interactions that they were already doing with people in communities.
Great, thank you. So I think, I mean, we have a little more time. We have 5 more minutes in our schedule. One of the question is defining the region of the Lower Mystic River watershed. Is how does the group take into account and engage with those who work in but don't live in the area, who are also vulnerable to climate impacts, outdoor workers, those groups who might, part of the community.
Yeah, I can start to answer that question. Anyone can add if they would like. But, I think I want to make the point, first of all, we can't reach everybody, right? And so it was a relatively small sample size in a very large area. So we were going to miss some groups of folks. But we did our best by hiring these or partnering with these community-based organizations who are actually on the ground and focused on reaching those priority populations. And so theoretically, if we wanted to focus on outdoor workers in particular, construction workers, so forth, then we could also partner with community-based organizations such as MassCosh, who focuses on workers' rights. And they're doing a lot of work on making sure to, for example, have standards for outdoor workers in the summertime to maintain their heat resilience. So making sure to partner with folks who are already on the ground with those people would be one way to make sure to access those communities.
And I'll just add very quickly that it was actually a question on the survey, thanks to Melanie's foresight in challenging us on assumptions. So we actually had a question on the survey in terms of the type of vulnerabilities people had. We actually included being an outdoor worker as a type of as a category of vulnerability that people did select as part of it. So just wanted to flag that as well.
All right, this is good stuff to think about and for everybody to take home and learn some more about when it comes to these projects. I do want to have one quick question that might be our last question, but it doesn't have to be. So for people who are just kind of beginning this journey of developing trust and partnerships, what do you all envision as the prerequisites communities need to have for thinking about the needs of priority populations and how to incorporate those needs into project development so that equitable beginnings result in equitable outcomes and processes? In a nutshell, I mean, I know that's like a big topic, but what are some of the what's a good place to start? I guess that's mine. For people who are excited and jazzed and want to move on to bring this into their own work.
Zoe, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I think one thing that I have heard is that, it's one thing to listen, and then it's one thing to show that you're listening. It's a completely other thing to show the communities that you work for it with that you're listening, because a lot of the vulnerable populations that we're working with, they have been doing really great work in this space, and they have been talking about their needs and what they're looking for. And so I guess I would say in approaching this, it's important that we do our homework first. It's important that we know what's out there and that we're recognizing that work, and that we're not building over top of it, but we're really taking in what's going on so that we're working in lockstep and we're working in partnership. That's what I've heard from folks, and that's been a big takeaway for me over the past couple of years.
And I'll just add that I think oftentimes we develop relationships with community-based organizations as a result of a need that we have. And that I say that to say it's important to start building relationships now, like get to know, to Zoe's point around the research, and get to know what organizations are in the community already on the ground. There are a lot of grassroots organizations and communities who aren't getting the accolades, who aren't in the newspaper all the time. And so it takes some effort and work to do it. And if we really want to do this work well, taking those types of additional steps and different approaches are just the things that we have to do in order to meet the complexity of the challenge that we're trying to address.
I like it. Everybody who is thinking about submitting an action grant, take Dr. Martin's advice and words to heart, and plug that into your work development chart, so that you're building these networks now, and you're reaching out to people now, and you're looking for those natural networks that exist. So I am so appreciative of all the awesome insight you've given each and every single one of us today, and I really hope that people get to take it home with them and build it into their own practice. We're at time right now, so we're going to wrap up. I do want to put one plug in for my fourth grader who did the origami artwork for these slides. He was very excited about people seeing it, so as I promised him I'll tell people. But but other than that, unless there are any other questions that anybody has as a burning desire to address, I just think that we should probably call time and then just go forth and do awesome work in our communities and confront the challenge of our time.
Great.
Any takers?
Thanks so much, everybody, for joining. And again, we'll post the slides and the recording once we get it to the website.
All right. Well, thank you. Everyone have a great lunch and a great rest of your day.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody. Thank you so much.